thanks so much for being here. My name is Ann Carter, and I'm pleased to join my daughter here, Evelyn. And we'll do introductions in a minute. I just want to say a few things and just acknowledge the many family and colleagues and friends and others. And I know there are a number of elected officials in the office. In the audience, I'm not going to call you by name, but if you want to, I know you're used to being acknowledged. And some people from church, and I don't think anybody's here from LA necessarily.
No.
But,
I'm the only one crazy enough to do that.
and several colleagues from Alliant Energy, if you will also raise your hands.
Oh, nice. Alliant in the house.
Appreciate that support. So Evelyn and I were talking about the workshop, and we have a few objectives, I will say. One is to inspire you to read this book, Going by Yajesi, if you have not read it already, or read it again, as I definitely will be doing. And so aside from that, we're going to talk about just the impact of slavery on sort of present day inequity and what we do about that. But we also agreed that since I've known Evelyn her entire life, I think you've known me my entire life, that we would introduce each other. So Evelyn Ruth Carter, PhD, is my oldest child, and she, you may have perhaps come across her bio, but she graduated from Northwestern with her undergraduate degree and her master's from University of Illinois in Chicago, UIC, and then her PhD from Indiana University. I get confused because Purdue is where you did your postdoc.
Yes.
And
Too many schools.
I know. Up until a month ago, she was at UCLA with a title longer than, and that I remember and don't necessarily totally understand, but now she's a senior consultant for a firm called Paradigm. So she flew out from LA, arrived in the snow late Friday night, and here she is. So,
Thank you, Mom, for that wonderful introduction. And so, as many of you all, I think all of you know, this is my mother, Ann Carter, Ann Paris Carter. She received her bachelor's degree from Yale in music, actually, which I think is really cool. She's a wonderful violin player. She taught me to play the violin. I don't do it anymore, though, but that's not her fault. And she has worked, basically, a really inspiring story of working her way up through retail, actually. And so what I admire most about my mother is that she started off as, it wasn't an assistant buyer, it was something else I don't know. See, I don't know her, I've known her for all of her life, but I haven't known her for all of her life, right? But basically started off in a retail position and worked her way up through there, and then was working for Kaufman's, and which was owned by May Department Stores, and I'm basically gonna paraphrase how this happened here, and was like, we need somebody to do diversity work. And she was like, I can be that person because you need me to do it. And so she created the position to be the Vice President of Diversity for May Department Stores, and then has done that work for almost as long as I can remember. She courageously decided to transition to being the Director of Energy Efficiency for Alliant Energy, which I think was super cool because that was something that she had not considered doing before. And so I think a really nice way of showing how courageous and how brave she is, but also how much she loves learning. And then was asked to return to raucous applause, actually, to her position as Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Alliant. And so in addition to all of those things about my mother, I think the thing that I enjoy the most about her is that she's a little goofy. I really like her sense of humor, and I think that that is something that you will see as we are co-facilitating today. So everyone, Ann Harris Carter.
Thanks, Evelyn. So we put pads on all the chairs, and if you didn't, and pens, for my Alliant Energy colleagues who are here, we refer to this as vintage Alliant Energy. We spruced up our logo, so I figured I'd ask forgiveness rather than permission, and I've got this huge box of pads in my office. So does anybody need a pad? Because we do have some more over there. Maybe I could get some help. Because what I'd like you to do on a pad or on a piece of paper, or if you insist, do this in your head. I want you to write down 2 things on that pad or piece of paper, or think in your head. And we're not going to ask you to share with the full group, so I just want to put you at ease, but I'm going to read these questions. The first is, what is the number one reason that you are here today? It's for you only. I just want you to memorialize that. It might be because your mom made you do it, or your boss, or your teacher, but write that down. And then the second, which we will ask you to reflect on again at the end, is what's the main thing that you are hoping to take away from today? What are your expectations? So just jot down a few words or phrases that will help you remember that. And then we'll get started.
Bullet points are acceptable too.
All right, let's see a few pens still, so I'll give you the time. So you know that there are several events happening here in Cedar Rapids, around the broader region and around the United States, for example, to celebrate what is now a national holiday, Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And so we have the privilege of co-facilitating today, and really what inspired us is this book, Homegoing, which I've been saying, right, Homecoming. It's
Yes.
Homegoing, there's a movie or something. Homegoing, which Evelyn has been telling me for some time, it is her favorite book. And Evelyn reads a lot. Evelyn reads quite a bit more than her mother, whether it is fiction or research. And so one of the things that we learned in preparing for this is that, two things really, we have different styles of reading. So as I was doing my smiley faces and ouch and underlining and highlighting, she's like, what are you doing? No wonder it takes you so long. And the second thing that we learned is we also have different styles in prepping for workshops. So this has been fun and a learning, I think, for both of us. But I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about this book. And while much of today will be about our own stories and how that impacts or what we see in the world around us and desire for tomorrow, so to speak. But it's really this book, again, called Homecoming. I'm going to read a few excerpts. And the author, Yajasi, actually spent 2 years at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which I realized when I started reading the book. So that was an extra delight for me. And I took some excerpts from some interviews on NPR and book reviews. So I'm just going to read you a little bit. And it is one of those books that at the end of almost every chapter, it's like, because something happened that I didn't expect it, or what's the rest of the story? So I've tried to prepare this so that there won't be any spoilers.
No spoilers at all. Worked very hard to make sure.
Very hard. So here's what the story's about. Two half-sisters, Ifya and Essie, are born into the Fante and Asante tribes of 18th century Ghana. Efwa, oh, Andrew, I might not be saying that right. Efwa, thank you. Andrew, a co-worker, helped me with some pronunciations I may need help with. Efwa, newly married to an Englishman, tours Cape Coast Castle, her new home. She walked around in complete awe, running her hands along the fine furniture, made from wood the color of her father's skin. The silk hangings so smooth, they felt like a kiss. She breathed everything in, stopping at the gun platform that held huge black cannons facing out toward the sea. Then she felt a breeze at her feet from small holes in the ground. Then she asked, "What's below?" "Cargo," was the response. Then carried up with the breeze came a faint crying sound. So faint, Efwa thought she was imagining it until she lowered herself down, rested her ear against the grate. "Are there people down there?" "Yes," was the response. And so, later on in the story, we named Efwa's sister, who ends up below that grate. where the breeze comes up and where the faint sounds. That is the castle's dungeon. And her sister Essie ultimately is sold into slavery in America. And here's how Essie describes it. The smell was unbearable. Essie had been in the women's dungeon of the Cape Coast Castle for 2 weeks. She spent her 15th birthday there. On her 14th birthday, she was in the heart of Asante land, in her father's big man's compound. He was the best warrior in the village, so everyone had to come pay their respects to the daughter who grew more beautiful with each passing day. When she wanted to forget the castle with the unbearable smell, she thought of these things. But she did not expect joy. The soldiers came in with the same mushy porridge that had been fed to them in the Fonte village where Essie was held. Essie had learned to swallow it down without gagging. It was the only food they ever received, and their stomachs were empty more days than so. The porridge passed right through her, it seemed. The ground was littered with cherries, the unbearable smell. So I will share in a bit some of my reflections and reactions, but I will tell you at the outset, this book made me realize I need to do a whole lot more study about slavery, and particularly slavery that started in African villages and what that meant in my family heritage. Evelyn came away with slightly different takeaways, so I'm going to ask you to share.
Yeah. So when I first read Homegoing, I have a little confession for you. And I talked about this a little bit. So when I was growing up, there were basically 2 times in my U.S. history classes that we would talk about Black people. Who knows what those 2 times were? Maybe 3, but usually 2. Who knows? Yeah.
8th grade and 11th grade.
Oh, you mean so we can think of time literally. I like that, right? Thinking about when these things come up in the curriculum. So maybe 2 times when we're talking, let's contain it within one academic year, right? 2 themes in which might be discussed during U.S. history, where we talk about Black people. Civil rights movement and slavery, right? And maybe we get some thrown in for Black History Month. Maybe MLK Day will be like, we're getting the day off on Monday, woo! And here's why, right? So when I was growing up, for me, Blackness was very much associated with this idea that you were either a slave or you get to talk about civil rights movement and woohoo, everything was solved, and we all know that was not the end of the story, right? So I had a really hard time for years reading books that had to do anything with slavery. I avoided, I have not seen 12 Years a Slave, I refused to. Any of the movies, books, TV shows, no matter how good they were, I would not read it. And I don't remember what it was that made me pick up Homegoing. I think it was probably on a list from BuzzFeed. They have, by the way, really good lists of books to read. And so I picked up the book and I read it. And it's interesting because even as I'm listening to the passages that my mom selected, when I was reading the book, it didn't feel as deeply hurtful as I thought it was. It didn't bring with me the kind of idea that I felt in high school of, oh, look, this is when we talk about Black people again. And I think that there are a couple reasons for this. One, the writing in the book is fantastic, but I think more interesting than that, it's written from a perspective that I have never heard before. And I think that comes from somebody who has deeply thought about what slavery is like and might have felt like and really envisioned that, having her write the book. And so I think that was an important part of it. But what it did bring up for me as I was reading, and I have said a million times, this book has changed my life, and I still feel that way, is that I felt almost healing after I read the book. Because the book tells the story, as you heard, of twin sisters who one stays behind in Africa, the other gets sold into slavery, and it follows their lineage. And there is this point toward the end of the book where you realize you are, I think you counted 8 generations, right? 8 generations removed from slavery. You can still feel the effects of it on the characters that are being described. But even more than that, I realized what the book was doing for me was helping me to create and envision what my heritage might have been. because I don't really know, right, where I came from. Although Ancestry DNA did try to tell me I'm from Nigeria, and then they were like, just kidding, our science has been updated, so it's not Nigeria, it's Cameroon, I think, was where it is. Anyway, so I don't know where I'm from, right? But there was this ability, when I was reading Homegoing, to envision where I might have been. Who were the people that I was walking past? And for a while after I finished reading Homegoing, I would walk past a black person and be like, I think you're related to me? Maybe, I don't know. And so what it brought to mind was actually, and I want you all to reflect if you've heard of this assignment, was an assignment that my brother got, I believe my sister got, I also got it in high school, and now my niece, who's a second grader, has gotten this assignment, where we were all supposed to write down our family tree, right? And find the oldest person in our family to interview and talk about our family history and lineage. How many of you have done this assignment, have heard of this assignment, your kids have done the assignment, you've assigned the assignment, right? If you've assigned the assignment, then you might have gotten a parent like Ann Carter who came into your office and explained why that might be difficult. So there are a couple things that I thought were interesting about the book, because it allowed me to articulate why that assignment was so difficult for me to grapple with, right? Because I didn't know, but suddenly the book gave me the power to explain what might have been, who the people were that could be walking around every day that might be related to me. And so for me, reading Homegoing was very much a literary experience, but it also was a personal journey through which I got to see myself reflected in the book. And so that's something that I think quite a bit, a lot. And so if you bear with me, when I do workshops, I'm super interactive. So I would like to hear from you all. You don't have to raise your hand, but just like kind of shout it out. When you think about your favorite book, what is it that makes that book your favorite? If you don't have a favorite book, now it's time to figure that out, right? So when you think about your favorite book, what are some of the things that really stick out to you as why it's your favorite? Encouraging. It's encouraging. What's your favorite book? The Bible. Oh, all right. It's encouraging. There are plenty of stories in the Bible that'll really get you going, right? What else? Human connection. Yeah, what else? The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind? What about that is, what about that book is? Tenacity in everyday life. Ooh, I love that. Oh, you're just describing it with passion. I gotta read that book. What else? Anything else? When you think about your favorite book, what it inspires in you?
Insights into a world I might not have experienced.
Insights into a world you might not have experienced, yes. Anything else?
Character development.
Character development, yes. So here's the thing. I can guarantee you, this is like my pitch for the book, you will find all of that and more in the book Homegoing if you have not read it already. And my personal experience reading it was just one of many stories that I have shared with people who have read the book, who are a variety of races and ethnicities, who say that there was something in it for them that sparked a feeling. And my mom always, that's the last thing I'll say, my mom has a definition of what she calls a good movie. She says it has to make you laugh, has to make you cry, and has to make you think. And I am just here to tell you that I was next to my mom as she was reading Homegoing, and she was laughing out loud, she was gasping. I didn't see the tears, but I could feel them coming from her, and it definitely makes you think. So from my heart to all of yours, I implore you to read this book, not just because of what it did for me, but because of what I'm confident it can do for all of you. So that's my thing that I got out of it. But it was very interesting when my mom read the book to hear what the things were that it brought out for her.
Yeah. So one of the things, and there were several, but the one that I want to share today has to do with the lineage and our history, and then more specifically, that mother-child relationship. And I know some of you I've talked with a little bit who have read some or all of the book, and every person that I talked to came with a slightly different takeaway. But for me, as we go through the 8 generations of these 2 half-sisters, in every case it made me think about a mother and her love or protection for a child, or in some cases, the bitterness and resentment and maybe even manipulation. And so just thinking of the tragedy and the challenges that can come with motherhood, and some literally, not a spoiler, but it probably won't surprise you, some mothers in this book who literally give their life to save their child. And in some cases out of love, and in some cases out of resentment. You read it and see what you get. But as a mother, as Evelyn shared the story about the assignment that she and her siblings received, and then just this last November as we're getting ready for the Mayflower, and my other daughter is telling me that my granddaughter got that assignment. Are you serious? She goes to school in LA. Unfortunately, there's a strike. She goes to school in LA, one of the most multicultural, multiracial school districts. Are you kidding me? And I say that because there is some difficulty, and I understand that many people cannot trace their history back to the 13th century or whatever. But in our family, it's kind of hard to get too much longer than, I don't know, Sarah, what we 1850s maybe, because of a lot of work that that our father did. And so I did, probably the most vivid memory that I had is going in and talking to the teacher and explaining, I think not in an Ann way, which is a certain tone of voice.
Mm-hmm. It's very certain.
But I think not in that tone of voice, and had this conversation, and the teacher really did say, well, I didn't think about that. Now, does that mean the teacher didn't assign that same homework the next year? I don't know. But it was a conversation starter for us. And so when I think about my own family and the stories that I've heard, the other theme, and I'm just going to read another excerpt, was the idea of history, and again, lineage, and what we may or may not know about our history. And sometimes that might be because it's slavery, but I know there are many other factors. But this is the excerpt. History is storytelling. This is the problem of history. We cannot know that which we were not there to see and hear and experience for ourselves. We must rely upon the words of others. Those who were there in the olden days, they told stories to the children so that the children would know, so that the children could tell stories to their children, and so on and so on. But now, we come upon the problem of conflicting stories. Whose story do we believe then? We believe the one who has the power. He is the one who gets to write the story. So when you study history, you must always ask yourself, whose story am I missing?
So this idea of stories and of lineage and of parents and all of that is like not even a fraction of the book. There's so much in there. But one of the things, so I am a social psychologist, and as a social psychologist, all of my research basically has focused on how do people decide what counts as racial bias. Turns out as many people as there are in this room are different definitions of what counts as bias. But what I've really been interested in is not just how we decide what counts as bias, but how we have conversations about it and then what we do about it. And what was really crystallized for me as I was reading this book was being able to see the impact of not just discrimination on an interpersonal level, but really to see the structures that existed, that were developed in order to allow the systems of oppression to persist. And so what I would like to share, if you don't mind, a little bit of time with you all doing is thinking about this concept of structural discrimination. And I promise you it is relevant as in the book in a couple of ways. When we encounter one of the characters who I'm not going to give you too much because I promised you no spoilers, right? But when we encounter one of the characters, we find out that he is in prison. When we encounter another one of the characters, we find out that he is struggling with drug addiction. When we encounter another one of the characters, we find out that he's struggling with issues of loneliness and abandonment. And all of these characters, if you have read the book and know the story of the family that came before them, you can easily say, oh my gosh, I get it. I see what's going on. But I think that for many of us, that clear connection to the inequities that we see in society today and its link to slavery might not be as clear. So I have a question for you. Anybody in this room watch the show Blackish? Yes, okay. So something that they started doing in the past couple of seasons, first of all, if you haven't watched the show, I highly recommend it. It is so funny. But one of the things I think is great about Language is that Anthony Anderson's character works in an advertising agency with basically 3 or 4 other white guys and 1 other black guy. And basically, anytime they are sitting around the table, you're laughing because I think you know, anytime they're sitting around the table in this advertising agency, it is basically Anthony Anderson's opportunity to drop some knowledge on his white coworkers. And he usually ends up relating whatever they are seeing going on in that current moment to slavery. So much so that his boss actually was like, oh no, you're going to link this to slavery, but I can tell you it's not related to slavery. And his boss tried to do the telling the story back, and he was like, oh crap, it ends with, or it begins with slavery. So when we're talking about structural discrimination today, particularly within the context of inequality that members of the black community face, it all goes back to slavery, right? But there's this idea that discrimination is something that is interpersonal, that if you're not saying the N-word, if you're not doing things that are abhorrently racist, that you are not discriminating. When the reality is there are structures and there are systems that are set in place that even if people in them get to say, no, I didn't mean it that way, they are still allowing these inequities to persist. So with that, I said I'm interactive. If I asked you to define structural discrimination, how would you define it? And there is a right answer, but like, there's no right answer. This is I want to hear it. Yeah.
I think structural discrimination would be features of the social structure, the economic structure that tend to, perhaps as an unintended consequence, discriminate against a certain class or definitive group of people.
Yes. Structures of the situation, socially, economically, that tend to, maybe unintentionally, right, discriminate against and or favor certain people because of their group membership. I love that. What else?
And that
Ooh, legally, yes, we could add lots of things, right? Yes, legally. What else did you
Redlining and discrimination in housing or lending.
Yes.
Long history of that.
Yes, redlining and lending when it comes to housing. Fantastic. Other examples, this is the most fun you guys have had all day, isn't it? Structural discrimination, slavery, we're hearing, excerpts of cargo and all that. Yeah, I promise, this is good stuff. What else? How else would we define,
Gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering, yes. What else?
Education.
Education? When we think about structure,
Refusing to employ someone of a different race.
refusing to employ. So particularly when we think about the way, let's broaden that out a little bit, right? Because I think that's a wonderful example of how, kind of like in the loaning, there is a way for it to be both individual, right? So if I am the person who's the hiring manager, I could choose not to hire you, right? We could also think about systems that are set in place, for example, that allow discrimination against certain groups of people, right? So when we think about, there's a current conversation about banning the box for people who've been previously incarcerated, right? And I think that is a wonderful example now, no matter where you fall on the issue, of recognizing that there has been a rule that has been put in place that said we're okay with letting certain people not have access to these resources, right? And so I think that that's a wonderful example of how something can be both individual but also structural. Anything else? We've hit on a lot of things. Yeah.
The amount of people who are incarcerated
Yeah. The incarceration rates for black people, right? For black people and Latino folks as well, relative to white. So these are all examples of structural discrimination. And maybe it's because I gave a fantastic preamble that you all were like, oh yeah, I know what she's looking for. But I think it's that you all have been thinking about this question for quite some time. And I think that the reality is that we recognize that within our society, we can see the remnants, not just of slavery, right? But of what happens when we try to ignore our past. And so the final thing that really resonated with me in this book was not just understanding the connection between what has happened in the past and where we are in the current and where we could go in the future, but this idea of understanding that in all reality, the biggest issue for the present generation where the book ends off is not that they were descendants of slaves, it's that people wouldn't talk to them about where they came from. It's that people didn't talk to them about what their ancestors had experienced and witnessed. There was no opportunity to really consider how that experience might have been reflected in their own lives, based on their own choices, but more often than not based upon how society had shuffled them through the system. And so I encourage you, just like you're having these conversations, you all named a number of things, and we'll talk about what you can do after you've named them, right? But you've named a number of things today that are examples of how structures of inequality can exist. And I really encourage you to keep talking about it. Because there is nothing that I hate more than getting in front of a group of people and I'm like, you guys, the incarceration rates are quite different and the sentencing rates are quite different, and people are like, prove it. And I show them data, they're like, no, prove it for real, right? So you all have the knowledge, and I encourage you perhaps to use this book as a starting point, right? Maybe there's a book club you can start and have a really great conversation like what we're having now. But remind people that there are things that we can learn from having those open conversations about our past and how they can inform where we are today. Yeah, tell me.
Abortion rates.
There you go, abortion rates. And so I have lots of stories, and this was a particularly interesting one. So my mom mentioned, and then I'm stopped talking. My mom mentioned that I went to Purdue University. I did my postdoctoral fellowship there, which is a year basically of more research after you finish your PhD, because after you finish a PhD, of course you want to just be in school for longer. And there was I don't actually know what kind of group it was, but let's call it a pro-life group that had come to campus. And Purdue University is, I think, 80% white and 4% black. And they had put flyers on the Black Cultural Center, specifically targeting them, saying the most dangerous place for a baby is in a black woman's womb. And then they said, hashtag Black Lives Matter. This is relevant to me because one of those people chased me down to tell me about how I needed to make sure that I was doing everything that I could to make my room a safe place for these individuals, for the babies that I would soon inhabit. It was really fun because I was with my boss at that time. And so there's nothing quite like being chased down by somebody screaming at you about abortion while you are hanging out with your boss. Now, again, maybe not relevant, maybe it is, but I do think that there's something interesting about the narratives that we tell people, right, about their bodies, the access to resources in healthcare, and I think that that goes beyond just abortion rates, but also thinking about the experiences that Black mothers have, right, when they go to the doctors. Serena Williams and Beyonce, my favorite people, talk about their own experiences, right? There are lots of places, ways in which we can see that inequity pop up, even in places that we might not think it does. So think about that, have that conversation, and I think that it's hard sometimes to think about it at that abstract level, but bringing it down to a more concrete level, for particularly Cedar Rapids, is something that my mom is going to do for you all.
So I'm going to do something before I talk more about Cedar Rapids, which is, because you mentioned that part of the challenge is you got to the end of the book and thinking about those difficulties, I'm paraphrasing, I think, were not so much rooted in slavery as there just wasn't somebody to tell the story. And so we talked about, so we'll go ahead and do that now. I'd actually like you to share with each other, and I'm going to suggest, the fun thing about these chairs is that they roll, which is a great thing. They roll. I just want to encourage you to be safe because I do want you to rearrange yourself in, just groups of 3, maybe no more than 4, just so everybody will get a chance to share. And what we want you to share is, what do you remember from how your family talked about race when you were growing up? And this is a question that we used at a session at work, and it was really interesting. So we'll give you 10-ish minutes. We'll kind of walk around and see. But if you'll literally reposition your chairs in groups of 3 and 4 and just share with each other, what do you remember about how your family talked about race when you were growing up?
Some of the things that you were discussing, and I have a few things on my mind. The first is, I just want to hear kind of what your answers to this question of what you remember about talking about race in your family and what your answers were. And then the second thing that I would like to hear is whether, as you were having the conversation in your groups, whether there was anything that you heard that surprised you, whether there was anything that you heard that kind of struck you as, I hadn't thought about that before. Whether there were any kind of patterns that you noticed. So any of those questions, what you talked about, things that surprised you, things that were like, oh, look at this pattern. There was a fourth one that I can't remember because, we're off top. But you get where I'm going. So who would like to share? The brave soul is going to go first. Yes.
So, me personally, I grew up in a small town, 1,500 people, white. So I don't recall this conversation. In the group I was in, it was brought up to jokes, and how it was more or less brought up. It was not a topic of discussion. That's all of the religion. It wasn't like a format. Now, amongst my group, it was interesting to hear all at once, there was some weird from fire. It wasn't something discussed in any of our family. It wasn't discussed at the kitchen table after dinner. However, there was one in my group, who grew up in Chicago. So it's in their forefront, it's in their face, it's in their environment. So I think depending on your environment and how it grew up, whether or not you
Yeah.
I was interested to hear someone not from where I was, how big of a deal it kind of was.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. So we're going to clap for every single person that shared. I think this is actually where it starts to get great. I talk a lot about having conversations about race, but you get to have these conversations with the whole room, maybe for the first time. So everybody is great for sharing. So there are a couple things that you said that I wanted to pull out. The first was that you said that you grew up in a small community, about 1,500 people in the town, white, as you said, white, right? And that everybody that you were talking to in your group basically said, yeah, this didn't really come up. Maybe in jokes was the one place that race did come up, but that the one person in your group that was from Chicago was somebody that had had more conversations about race. So maybe thinking about geography and how that plays into it, maybe the norms and the demographics of the setting. So thank you. Other folks want to share? You'll get applause. Yeah.
I grew up in eastern Kentucky, where black people are thin on the ground, and but the white version of race is very prominent and deeply ingrained, and I learned all that. And it wasn't until I was in my late adolescence, early adulthood, that a white man brought a story to conflict with that story that made me realize the baggage I'm carrying. A guy named Gordon Allport, who wrote The Nature of Prejudice.
He
And
is the
that was,
father of psychology, of social psychology, which is my field. I had to read his book. Oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm nerding out right now. Okay, yes, this is so cool. Origin story, I love it. Yeah.
But that was
Gordon Allport. Oh my God.
that was my awareness, and began a process that still continues. I sort of characterize at least white people as recovering racists. So that's kind of where I am.
Yeah. Oh, okay, we gotta give applause. So, just for a moment, so Gordon Allport literally is like the father of social psychology when it comes to my subfield of stereotyping and prejudice. And so his book, The Nature of Prejudice, was first published in 1950, and that is literally like the textbook of like our Bible in our field. So that's so cool. So you were sharing, but I think it's really nicely that goes into the quote that you were reading, Mom, from the book about history, right? And whose history we believe. And so this idea that there's one account of what happened from a person who's not in a position of power. And that when somebody else brings a conflicting story, what really happens there. I also love what you said about being recovering racist, and that there are these ideas that are just taught to you, and that you have to realize, like, I'm working every day to change those ideas. So I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. Oh, Gordon Allport, so cool. All right, other people. I promise to get as excited about whatever you're saying. Yes.
Sharing my story about double standard. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. My being fair skin, I was getting teased by other darker skins about how fair my skin was. Being teased about being white face, my mom, mess with a white man. So I had to deal with that pondering as a child. Then we moved on to the north side of the city. I'm still black. And then the other race
colorism, which I think is very interesting, right? But also something that I think is really interesting, talking about your lived experience, different from what we've heard previously, right? When people were like, they didn't really talk about race. You're saying, like, I talked about it because I lived it, right? I know people noticed me, and therefore I noticed what they were saying, right? So I think that that's a really interesting dynamic to pull out as well. Do you want to talk about the colorism piece, or?
I'll come back to it.
All right, we're going to come back to it. So I think that's a really interesting theme. Maybe like 2 more people. I love the share outs. This is my favorite thing. Yeah.
One interesting thing that one of our friends shared with me was that the small town that we're in, there was one African kid that shooting, and the person was very nice and awesome. So that was her perspective of a black person. And the other 2 were from small town, and they kind of, the dad was a farmer, and the relationship that was a working father. And then she talked about, what if she was today another person in college? She knew that from a parent's perspective, it probably was one of the decision that she made. The love was there. And then for me, coming from Africa, raised in Africa, coming to America, that discussion never came up. It was something that I learned maybe 12 years later when I was in college, that somebody actually had to tell me. And one of the things I shared with my group was go to JCPenney and see if you can get help. That was one way that the girl was there and she told me about things to see what way.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. There are several things I love about it, and if I may, another one of my favorite books is called Americana. It's written by a wonderful African woman, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and it's a book about an African woman who comes to the United States and realizes what being black in the United States actually means. And so I think it's very interesting to hear from the perspective of somebody who wasn't socialized within this particular way of thinking about race, in the United States, right? To understand that, it's like, we didn't talk about it, right? And it's so interesting to me that the same way that we've heard some other people say, we didn't talk about race, they're like, we didn't talk about it, but the reasons might be a little bit different, right? There's also something that you said about the exposure to, you get the one black kid in the neighborhood. People were like, oh yeah, we like him, he's nice, but would we want to let our daughters date him? Maybe not, right? And so this idea that people are okay, but only at arm's length. Maybe one more person to round us off. Yeah.
I think I'll just add a little bit to what Andrew was saying on the African experience. So the first time I had the conversation about race, especially with my family, is when I was coming to college in the U.S. I'm originally from Tanzania. So normally when you go away, you have grandparents, uncle, cousin, the entire elders, everybody talk to you. And there were two areas that was actually kind of conflicting about that. So you have the younger, generation. Mainly what they were talking about is basically when you go there, don't associate with African American and all this stuff. And the reason why is based on what they see on TV, the gang, the drugs, and all this stuff, because that's the perception that is out there. And then you have the older grandparents, like, do not marry a white woman. And they're coming from the context is coming from the historical facts based on what happened with the white women came to Africa and what they did, and these are not people you can trust, all the kind of stuff. So it was really actually conflicting. At the same time, getting all these messages, I'm coming to America. So most of the things I had to find out for myself when I got here, and all the stuff, and over time. And I think till my early 30s, that's when I kind of really figured out. I'm still figuring it out, I guess.
We all are, don't worry. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Pascal, for sharing. So I told you all, I think, well, in one version of my bio, I describe myself as a data geek because I really love data. So one of the things that I love about these kinds of prompts is that we get to see the data that exists really bear out in these very conversational ways. So one of the things that I find the most interesting when it comes to conversations about race is that when you ask people how old they were when they had their first conversation about race, what do you think the findings generally are? I mean, when do you think, like, the first time you had a discussion about what race was, why it mattered, if it mattered, the impact that it would have on one's life? Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
Probably the first time you as a child meet somebody of the other race, and you start wondering, why do we look different? And you ask your parents.
So you're getting at part of what it is, right? So for some people, the first time you have that conversation is when you meet somebody who's of a different race, right? What else? So that's actually on the lower end. What are some other findings that you think that we learned? Yeah.
I would guess that for somebody who's white, they're much older, and for someone who's black, they're much younger.
Yeah. Yes. So on average, the age that at least Black American, we've heard some different international perspectives right about this, but Black American children usually start having a conversation about race with their parents around age 5.
Oh.
Yes, around age 5. But for white children, that conversation doesn't happen unless it's in a situation where you're meeting a parent or a child for a different race. And then do you know what the conversation is? We're all the same. Don't worry about it. You're not supposed to say that, right? Anybody ever had that experience where your kid came home maybe and they were like, "Mommy, so-and-so has dark skin at school," and you were like, "Oh my God, my kid is racist. We can't talk about it." Anyone? It's okay. We're all friends here now, right? So there's this really, and I think we could see this here too, that the folks of color who were talking about their experiences either said, "I talked about race very early on because it was what I lived," right? But for the white folks in the room, the conversation about race wasn't really made salient top of mind until it had to be, because there was some big event happening in the world, or because you finally, met somebody who was from a different background or whatever. And so I think a lot about these conversations, and that part of the issue when we have conversations about race, when it comes to not just structural discrimination, but any kind of discrimination, is that we have different starting points in our comfort level, because for some of us, we've been having these conversations for years and years and years, and others are newer to that conversation. And so this is not meant to be an indictment on when it was you started talking about race, but to remind you that the earlier you start these conversations, right, the better off we will all be as a society. I'm done talking.
That's my cue.
That's your cue.
So I brought this just in case I would have an opportunity to use it as a prop. And so my question for you is, who knows the significance of this? It's just a paper bag that in my day, we would take our lunch to school. Back in the 1940s, 1950s. I see a few hands.
I've heard reference to black people being compared to the shade of a paper bag, and if you're darker than that, there are some implications of that. If you're lighter, there are implications of that. I don't remember any more details.
That's essentially it. Black people being compared to the color of this bag. Raise your hand if you, maybe that's vaguely familiar again. I'm just curious. Okay, let's do it. Raise your hand if this is the first time you've heard that.
I love it.
And so I brought this, so thank you for sharing your story, because I pulled this out. And so often what strikes me, and I'm gonna have to prioritize which stories to share. When I think about the storytelling in my family, or my memories of talking about race, our cousin walked in and came from Des Moines, and I asked the question about what he remembers, and he shared, and he ended, and I'm paraphrasing, but I remember you used the word oppression. And it was in the sense that never felt like they were telling from a standpoint of oppression. And actually, and I didn't say this to you, it made me pause. It's like, well, why should it be? So point for me is there's sort of an expectation, maybe, that there's a sense of oppression, at least in the family where we grew up. And I said to him, what I remember is particularly our Thanksgiving gatherings. And his grandmother and our aunt and my father would be talking in very animated voices. And I knew they were talking about something something that had to do with race, and on one wall, or still there in our room, in our family room, in the family home, we have 7 or whatever pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. We used to joke, you know, this is what, am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you go in I'm sharing our dirty one, if you go in a white home, you're more likely to see Jesus, a white Jesus. If you go into a black home, you're either going to see a black Jesus or you're going to see Martin Luther King Jr. these days, probably Barack Obama. But
The Holy Trinity.
I digress because I realized, even in that image of hearing the adults in the family talk, it was animated, but I didn't have a sense of oppression either. It was more like they were animated and excited talking about what they were doing because they knew something needed to be done. So one of the stories that I heard, that they shared, and this just goes back to my parents in the 40s and the 50s. Yes, in fact, my mother, who would, as we could say, pastor white, right, would have been able to join certain sororities and participate in certain activities because her skin was lighter than the color of the paper bag. My father, who had dark skin, would not have been able to. And even more shocking to me, my mom shared with me as I was becoming a mother, is at one point a doctor said to her, "Why did you marry someone with such dark skin? You could pass for white, and more than likely your children would have been able to too." A black woman. And so when we think about it, people say, well, why are we still hung up on slavery that was over 250? This is just my parents. And so I could go on and share other stories, but when we talk about lineage, and I thought I knew a lot about my family history. And maybe some of you have heard stories. My dad's known as the first black doctor in town, and my maternal grandparents, among the first black doctors in Waterloo, first black teacher in Waterloo. I don't know as much about my paternal grandparents because they both died when Dad was young. But sometimes you get tired of being the first. And we're still counting firsts. And so now that both of our parents have died, as we're sorting through papers and letters, one letter came up that never knew anything about. Maybe my older siblings did, because I'm number 8 and she's number 9 and there are 12 of us. But they were letters that our mother's piano teacher had written to Northwestern. I should say they were letters that our mother's piano teacher had received from Northwestern. And my mother, Evelyn Lilia Harris, is a very gifted pianist. And the story that I remembered was that she was preparing to go to Europe to study piano. And somehow met Dad, and they decided to get married and have 12 kids.
Paraphrased history.
And these letters were from her teacher, basically from the response we could tell, expressing, I have a very talented student, she wants to go to Northwestern. Guess how old my mom was when those letters were written? Oh, why do you say 13? You're right.
Well, because of the way you've couched it, it suggests that she was young, and if she was about ready, if she was thinking about college, she was in her probably early teens, so that's...
So
I like
thank
you.
Yeah. That shocked me. That already at age 13, she was thinking about going to Northwestern. And they basically responded, and there were 2 letters that said, well, we don't have housing for Negroes. She might consider something else. And, oh, we've had success. Yes, we have one Negro pianist who did quite well. And literally, this has just been within the last month or so, I think, that my sister actually discovered this. And what is quite ironic to me, that I used to want to go to Northwestern. I went to summer camp at Northwestern because it has a great music school. I have 2 brothers who went to Northwestern.
Northwestern.
Evelyn went to Northwestern, along with 2 of her cousins. And I don't think had an inkling of an interest. And again, maybe she told somebody else, but it just kind of takes your breath away to realize that, yeah, there's a gap in that history. Was there shame? Because that was related to race. She wasn't able to do something that at the time she really aspired to pursue.
I have a question prompted by something you just said. This is something I've wondered quite a bit. When you said, was there shame? Black people of that generation faced this kind of thing over and over and over. And I'm just wondering if you just kind of accepted it or got outraged every time, or was there a variety of responses? How did you deal with it?
So I think the short answer is, and there is research that says that yes, after experiencing that over and over again, you kind of set it aside. So now I'm going to tell another story, which is, I mentioned to Evelyn recently, I had a reunion this fall with some women from a singing group, an a cappella group, just 13 of us, so pretty intimate friendships from our college years. And one of them was saying, Anne, don't you remember when we went to such and such, shall remain unnamed country club in a very affluent area of DC, that they weren't going to let you in the front door? And I had been the business manager, so we were going on tour from Yale and heading down to DC and then further south. And don't you remember we looked at you and asked, and there was actually another woman, Latina, who was facing the same situation. And I vaguely, this is like one of those images that I feel like I have in my head because either I dreamed it or maybe somebody told me about it. But the funny thing is, again, I was the business manager, so I had made all the arrangements. I'm like, but I'm Ann Carter. It's like, no, the Ann Carter we spoke to was white. They never met me in person. But I shared with Evelyn that I didn't even remember that experience. So I would say, yes, we can probably engage even more about that. But it sort of becomes commonplace. And the last thing I will say about skin color is, I mentioned my mom could pass for white. Another vivid memory for me is when I was in 3rd grade. Mom was driving me to Marion, along East Coast Road for my piano lessons. And I had been wanting to ask Mom this question for a really, really long time. Because I'm in elementary school, whenever we talked about race, I still get this feeling. I don't have a chip on my shoulder, I assure you. You know, you have some memories where you still get the smell or the feeling. When we started talking about slavery, and the entire class would turn and look at me. I still have that feeling. I still know that feeling and the embarrassment. And so I finally asked Mom, I said, Mom, are you black? And she assured me, and so we had that conversation, but even as a child, not quite understanding what this is all about. And actually when I walked away, oh, well that means my best friend is, and she is, and he must be too. And so, but these stories, but all of that prompted by your story of Southside Chicago and memories about that.
So as you can see, we've spent a fair bit of time today reflecting both on the book, reflecting on what it meant to us, the different themes that it brought up for each of us. We've spent time asking you all about the stories that you've heard about race. And I think the thing that is the most important for me is that the stories in the book Homegoing, even though they are fictional, read to me as if they could be true. And so just as we are sharing our stories with each other today, just as my mom and I are sharing our stories and reflections with you, I hope that if nothing else you take from this workshop today, that talking about those stories is really important. And that having that discussion, having those conversations where you hear about the experiences that people have had, good, bad, and otherwise, and having those conversations and bringing those experiences to light is a really important way, one, to remember this special day as we remember Dr. King. But if we think about the impact that we can have on our society, those stories, those conversations are supremely important. So what we would like for you all to do, because we could never just end by saying, go out there and tell stories, because that's not it's important, that's not it, is to prompt reflection. So we are actionable individuals. We love giving people some good action items. And so what we would like for you all to do is reflect back on what you wrote at the beginning of this workshop about what you wanted to get out of this. And reflect on the things that you've discussed with the folks in your breakout groups earlier as we were talking about thinking about race. Reflect about the excerpts that you've heard my mom read about the book or the reflections that we each shared. And think about one or more, but at least one thing that you can do when you walk out of here to make an impact in Cedar Rapids, in Lynn County, in Iowa, in, those out and out and out. When it comes to how we think about and understand and interact with each other on the basis of race. What is the thing that you can commit to doing to making our society a more equitable and inclusive place that celebrates people's differences? Write that down, commit to it. You'll be talking about it with your neighbors, so prepare to discuss. And then we're going to do a little bit of sharing out before we close. Sound good? Write down your commitment.
With my grandchildren to go there and how are you feeling or what is it? And when you said that, I thought, well, I think that works both ways. It's one of the hindrances to the conversation. Am I how are they, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then my grandchildren I do think there is some difference in the second generation.
Oh, yeah.
They don't, there's a lot of biracial children, they don't, and they're kind of like, well, what's the big deal, or what are you talking about, and so it really helps you see the perspective was so different when I was growing up.
Yeah, yeah. So if I might take a liberty then, would one of your commitments be to have more conversations with your grandchildren? All right, there we go. Yes, thank you so much. I love that perspective, right? Other folks want to share out what their commitments are. Yeah.
I'm a volunteer with an organization called CASA. It stands for Court Appointed Special Advocates. I've been doing this for the last 5 years. And one of the things I really had to work hard on is my interpersonal relationships with the people, the black people that I'm interacting with. How to not be a jerk, how to not come across as someone who's trying too hard. And so my commitment, number one, is to continue to kind of smooth off my rough points and as far as doing that. But also, I'm working with one young person who is a 13-year-old black boy. And I got down here that I just want to double down on my efforts to help make sure he's not snagged up in some of the institutional discrimination and that particularly his dad has just come out of prison, and they're trying to reestablish that relationship. And so there are things I can do to be helpful with that.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what it all centers around for me.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so I think the thing that really stood out to me the most about your commitment is recognizing that there is a person you are working with who is basically caught up in this system of oppression, right? And that the thing that you can do to commit to is helping him to navigate, kind of resisting that system and to support him as much as possible in your volunteer role, which I love. Yeah. Other folks, I know that I'm on this side a lot, so I'm just going to come over here in case people over here want some special time. Yes, you know. Anybody else have a commitment they want to share?
I'm going to read that book.
I was going to say, nobody has said yet my commitment is to read Homecoming. Yes. Yes, we're going to read the book. Commit to that. All right, so on that note, I'm going to leave it to my mom to close out. But I just wanted to say for myself that I really appreciate this opportunity, really to start the conversation with you all. And I say all the time, reading is one of my favorite things. I truly do believe that reading gives you an opportunity to gain insight into others' experiences, into cultures that you haven't encountered into, just all of the ways in which people exist in this world. And so I start my journey with reading books, and I really hope that I have inspired you, that we have inspired you, that this book might be the one that you could begin your journey for understanding a slightly different experience. So thank you all. My mom is going to close us out.
Thanks, Evelyn. So I'd like to acknowledge Victoria Fernandez from the library. Todd, you have to come to the Your last name again?
Simonson.
Thank you, Simonson. So Paul from Iowa, came to Cedar Rapids on Thursday. Today's his first day of work here. From Arizona. So, thank you. But what Victoria wanted me to let the group know, any of these books here, as well as the ones back there, are available for checking out. Please watch social media for the Cedar Rapids Public Library, because there will be book discussion groups. I happened to get mine at Barnes & Noble. Was pleased that there were 5 or 6 copies there, and got some more from Amazon, as a matter of fact. So, which someone in this room has and has committed to reading. So these are available, and then much appreciation to those who are here. And as you're thinking about, I just look around this room, and some of you I know, some of I have seen for the very first time. And we all occupy our own space. And maybe there are circles where we overlap in the Venn diagram, right? And maybe we're completely separate circles, but we all influence at least one person. And so as you reflect on your commitment and what behavior or action you are vowing to change, I encourage you, there's so much great going on in this community. Not just in Cedar, in the broader Cedar Rapids area, so much around us. And I know there's a lot of yuckiness that happens in the world around us. And there's one initiative that I do want to cite, and you may be familiar with the SET task force that did quite a bit of research over the last few years. SET standing for Safe, Equitable, and Thriving Communities, and research around equity in education and housing, law enforcement, and a few other topics. And there are a number of people who worked in that room. Stacy Walker, who co-chaired that, Lake County Supervisor. Ruth, I know you were involved in now the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation with Carla Treatwell's leadership is going to be moving forward with implementing some of those. And I think there are others who participated in that, so please bear with me for not mentioning your name. But I trust that you're going to see more about that and what we're doing from a structural sense to make things better. And it takes more than one person, and it takes more than overnight. And so even if you're not actively engaged in that effort, just ask the question, hey, what's something I can do? Casa came to mind. My grandchildren. Everybody in this room influences at least one person. And so one other announcement, this is, Evelyn's on tour today. So she spoke at College this morning and had the privilege of doing this workshop with Evelyn, and then this evening she will be speaking at St. Paul's Methodist Church. Pastor Sherry is with us, as well as Pastor Jonathan and Pastor Clint from that ministry. And that is on 3rd Avenue Southeast. There's a dinner at 5:30. It is a community dinner, which means it's open to anyone. It is free. If you choose to provide an offering, that is your choice. We call that a free will offering. And then the program will begin at 6:30, and as I said, Evelyn will be speaking this evening, and there will be an award recognition as well. So thank you very much for being here. I think we're going to hang out for a little bit if anybody cares to chat or chat amongst yourselves. But thanks very much, everyone.